The ice went out of the river on a Thursday, and that was the day he told her he had been wrong. She had not been expecting it. She had been carrying water from the pump to the bean rows she'd started in April, thinking only about the distance between the pump and the garden. When he came around the corner of the barn, with mud still on his boots from the north field, and said it the way he said most things, plainly, without preamble, the way a man states a thing he has already decided. He said, "I told you last April I needed someone for the house and for the children. Nothing more than that." She set the bucket down and waited. He said, "I was wrong about the nothing more." To understand what that cost him, and what it cost her to stand still and hear it, you have to go back 11 months, to a Wednesday afternoon in early May, when the post office in Millhaven, Manitoba was the only warm building she could find. And the postmistress, a small woman named Bertie, who wore her hair in a single gray braid down her back, had let her sit by the stove without asking too many questions. She had been sitting there for 2 days. The letter that explained her situation was tucked into her coat pocket, though she no longer needed to read it. She had memorized it in the way you memorize something that has rearranged your life without your permission. The school board of Millhaven had dissolved in November. The school had closed. Teaching position she had accepted in January and planned her entire spring around. The trunk she had packed, the train from Sudbury, the connection at Winnipeg she had nearly missed. All of it had been built on a thing that no longer existed. She did not cry in the post office. Bertie noticed this the way women notice these things in small towns. The man came in that second afternoon for a parcel he had been expecting since March. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the plank floor, a voice that spoke in whole sentences but used them sparingly. He had a boy of perhaps 4 balanced on one arm, and a girl of 7 or 8 walking close enough to his side that her sleeve brushed his coat with every step. He collected his parcel. He signed where Bertie pointed. He was on his way out when Bertie said, in the particular way of a woman who has decided something, that she thought he ought to speak to the young woman by the stove. He turned and looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a field before deciding whether to plant it, not with curiosity, with assessment. "You're the school teacher," he said. "I was going to be." He looked at the parcel in his hands, at the boy on his arm who had fallen asleep somewhere between the doorway and where they were standing, at the girl who was watching the woman with the particular attention of a child cataloging something new. "My housekeeper left in January," he said. "Going to her daughter's in Ontario. I expected her back by March." She waited. "She's not coming back." It was not a question he was building toward. She understood that. He was laying down facts the way a man lays down planks, one at a time, testing the weight before committing to the next. "House is 12 miles out," he said. 2 children. Planting season starts next week, and I can't be in 2 places at once." He looked at her once more, and this time she had the sense he was seeing whether she would look away first. She didn't. "I need someone for the house, for the children. That's all I'm saying." It was the plainest offer she had ever received, and also the only one on the table. "I can manage a house," she said. "Pay is small. Room is the one off the kitchen." He shifted the sleeping boy to his other arm. "I'm not looking for anything beyond what I said. I understood you the first time." Something in his expression shifted, not quite approval, but a movement in that direction. He nodded once. He picked up his parcel. He said, "Wagons outside," and that was the whole arrangement. The drive out was quiet in the way the prairie is quiet. Not empty, but enormous, the silence too large to fill with ordinary conversation. The girl sat between them on the wagon seat and watched the road with the fixed attention of someone who had learned that home is always a place you travel toward. She said her name was Iris. She did not ask for a name in return, which, later, the woman would come to understand, was Iris's particular way of offering something without demanding anything back. The boy slept the whole 12 miles. The house was low and gray-sided, the kind of structure that looked like it had grown out of the ground rather than been built on top of it. A barn bigger than the house stood 40 feet to the east. A kitchen garden, weedy and unattended, ran along the south wall. She looked at it the way she had looked at the post office in Millhaven, assessing, not hoping. "Guard'll need work," he said, not by way of apology. "I can see that." He carried her trunk inside without asking whether she needed help, and she understood this to mean he was not the sort of man who asked before acting on what seemed necessary. She filed that away. The kitchen smelled of wood ash and something left too long on the back burner, a pot of oats gone thick and wrong. Iris went immediately to the pot and looked at her with an expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite apology. The woman went to the stove without being told and found the damper lever, which required turning a full quarter past the point where it seemed to want to stop. This was the kind of thing a house tells you only by what it does badly until you've done it right once. She turned it. The draw improved and the oats went out to the yard. Supper, standing up that first night. Bread and beans she'd assembled from what the pantry offered and left the table without comment. She took the silence for what it was, not rudeness but a man doing arithmetic in his head about the planting. The boy woke from his nap at dusk and came into the kitchen on bare feet, squinting, not yet certain of where he was or who she was. His name was Pip, Iris told her, not his proper name, but the one that had stuck. She poured him milk. He drank it still squinting. He did not say thank you, but he set the cup down carefully, which was its own kind of manners. She did not unpack her trunk that first night. She lay in the room off the kitchen, cedar-scented, narrow, with a window that looked onto the garden, and listened to the house find its rhythm around her, wind pressing at the eaves, the boy turning in his sleep down the hall, the man's boots crossing the floor above her once, then again, then settling into quiet. By the third morning, she had mapped the house's particular logic. The pump in the yard needed priming if the temperature had dropped overnight. The root cellar door swelled in rain and had to be shouldered rather than pulled. Iris woke before anyone and sat at the kitchen table with a book she had clearly read many times over, its spine cracked to the same page each morning. She did not speak until spoken to, but she did not leave the room either, and the woman came to understand that this was Iris's version of welcome. He worked from before light until after dark, and he ate what she put in front of him without commentary. By the second week, she had noticed that when the bread came out right, he took a second piece without being asked, and that this was the shape his satisfaction took. Not words, but appetite. The middle of May turned cold again the way Manitoba springs turn cold, with no warning and no apology. She found a box of wool remnants in the cedar chest under the window and spent 3 evenings letting Pip's cuffs down as far as they would go and patching the elbows of Iris's coat. He came in one evening and stood in the doorway, watching her work for a moment before going back out to the barn. He said nothing. But the following morning there was a new spool of brown thread on the table that she had not put there. June arrived with heat and the smell of turned earth, and the days took a shape she began to trust. Fire before light, bread by mid-morning, the garden she was reclaiming one weedy row at a time. Iris helped with the weeding without being asked, pulling with a methodical patience that reminded the woman, unexpectedly, of herself at that age. Pip preferred to supervise from a safe distance, offering opinions she had not solicited about which weeds were worse than others. He came in from the fence line one evening at the end of June with a cut on his forearm from a wire, bleeding more than was sensible to ignore. She cleaned it and wrapped it at the kitchen table while he sat with his hand flat on his knee and looked at the wall. He did not wince, he did not thank her. But that night he brought in a full week's worth of firewood without being asked, stacking it inside the door rather than leaving it on the porch. And she understood this was how he returned things he did not have words for. July and August were good months. Rain enough, sun enough. The garden gave them more than she'd expected from soil that hadn't been tended properly in years. She put up preserves in the cellar, snap beans, pickled beets, 3 dozen jars of plum jam from the old tree at the back of the property that had gone unharvested the autumn before. He saw the jars one afternoon, lined up on the cellar shelf, and stood there with his lamp held up, reading them the way a man reads an account ledger he had expected to find worse. He said, "You didn't have to do all that." She said, "I know." He went back up the cellar stairs and she heard the screen door bang twice before it settled. She had learned by then that the screen door's double bang meant something had satisfied him. September came in cool, and the light changed the way it does on the prairie. Lower, more horizontal, everything throwing long shadows by 3 in the afternoon. And she noticed him standing at the fence line one morning with his hat pushed back, reading something in the sky she had not yet learned to read herself. He began that week to stack firewood against the north wall of the house instead of the east, which she had not seen him do before. She did not ask why. The first snow came on a Friday in October, a dusting that melted by noon. He said nothing about it. She watched him and did not say anything either, and when Iris came home from the school in town with frost on her collar, she hung it by the stove to dry without being asked, and that settled something. November arrived with its teeth showing. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 days, and the sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that way. She woke on the 12th of November to Pip crying in the dark. Not the frightened crying of a nightmare, a different kind, the shallow gulping sound of a child whose body is doing something wrong. She had the lamp lit and water on before she had fully decided to do either. He appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, already dressed, which meant he had not been asleep. "I'll go for the doctor," he said. "It's a croup. The steam will manage it. Boil more water." He stood in the doorway a moment, a man unused to receiving instructions in his own house, and then he went and boiled more water without argument. She held Pip over the pot with a towel draped across their heads, and the boy's breathing eased by increments over the next hour, and by 4 in the morning he was asleep again, damp-haired and wrung out, one fist closed around the collar of her coat. She sat with him until light. At some point, the man came and set a cup of tea on the floor beside her chair, said nothing, and went back out to the barn for the early feeding. She drank it cold at 6 in the morning when the boy finally let go of her collar, and it was the best thing she had tasted in months. The blizzard came at the end of November and stayed for 12 days. She had not understood before that winter what 12 days of no visibility and -40 meant to a place like this. The drifts came up past the kitchen window on the 3rd day and kept climbing. He went out to the barn twice daily through a rope he had strung between the house and the barn door in October, before the snow, before she'd known why he'd done it, and came back each time gray with cold, his brows white with frost. She had food warm for him both times without discussing it. He ate standing up with his coat still on and went back out. Iris read everything she could find in the house, twice. Pip became philosophical about confinement in the way of small children who have no true sense of how long 12 days actually is. She taught them both by lamplight. Iris's arithmetic, Pip's letters, and a geography lesson about places neither of them had been that somehow became a lesson about places she had been herself. And she found she was saying more aloud than she had said to anyone since autumn. On the 6th night of the blizzard, she was sitting by the stove after the children had slept when he came in from the late barn check. He did not go upstairs. He came and sat in the chair on the other side of the stove, his chair, the one he occupied when he occupied any chair, which was seldom, and they did not speak for a long while, and that silence was different from all the other silences, which had been the silence of people with separate work. This was the silence of two people doing nothing in particular, in the same room, by choice. She said, at some point, that the temperature had stopped dropping. He said he thought so too. That was all, but she did not forget it. The blizzard broke on the 12th day. He spent 3 days digging out. She brought food to the barn doorway rather than making him walk to the house. And he ate standing in the cold, and she went back inside and started more. And neither of them remarked on this arrangement, as though it had always existed, as though it had not begun with a woman who 3 weeks ago had still been sleeping with her coat folded under her pillow in case she needed to leave in the night. March thaw came slow and incomplete, the snow retreating by inches, the mud arriving as the snow left. She began to think about what came next, not anxiously, the way you think about something that has been set aside long enough that you owe it your attention. The letter from her cousin in Toronto arrived on the 14th of March, forwarded twice, nearly 6 weeks late. Her cousin had a spare room. There was work at a city school for a woman with her qualifications. She read it at the kitchen table alone, and then read it again, and then set it face down on the oilcloth beside her cup. She did not mention the letter, but she thought about it for a week. The room off the kitchen, its cedar smell she had long since stopped noticing. The crack in the plaster above the window that followed the same path as a river on the geography map she used with Pip. The sound of his boots crossing the floor above her in the evenings. 3 steps, the creak of the chair, then quiet. On the 22nd of March, a family passed through Millhaven heading east and stopped at the farm to ask if he had grain to sell. Their wagon had room. Their direction was Toronto by way of Winnipeg. The woman in the wagon leaned across the fence and spoke to her in the easy way of prairie women. Was the winter hard? Was she keeping well? Was there anything she needed from town before they moved on? The offer was not stated directly, but it was there in the space beneath the question, available if she wanted to reach for it. She could have asked to ride along. She thought about it that night, lying in the cedar room. She thought about it the next morning while she turned the damper lever its necessary quarter, turned past where it wanted to stop. She thought about it in the cellar, counting jars by lamplight, the plum jam she'd put up in August from the tree she had not known she would tend a second season. She thought about it, and she stayed. She did not tell him she had made a decision. There was nothing to announce. She was simply there, the same as the day before and the day before that. And she supposed he had noticed and supposed he would say something when he had worked out how much of it needed saying. Iris appeared at the kitchen table one morning in early April while she was mixing bread, sat down without her book, and said without preamble, "Are you going to stay?" She kept working the dough. "Where would I go?" "When the road clears properly," Iris said. "When it's easy to leave." She pressed the bread down and turned it. She thought of the post office in Millhaven, the stove she'd sat beside for 2 days, Bertie's braid, the particular quality of waiting for something to be decided for you. She thought about what it had felt like to stop waiting and choose. "I think I'm already staying," she said. Iris looked at her hands in her lap. Then she said, "Pip calls you something when you're not in the room. It's not your name. I don't think he knows your name properly." She didn't ask what the name was. She shaped the loaf and set it to rise, and something in the kitchen felt like a window being opened in a house that had been shut up all winter. Small, not declared, just air moving where it hadn't moved before. The ice on the river had been going out all week, the sound of it carrying flat across the land in the mornings like something being pulled loose from where it had been held too long. She could hear it from the pump. She could hear it from the garden. It was the sound of an entire season giving way, slow and grinding and inevitable, and she had come to find it a comfort. She was filling the bucket at the pump when he came around the corner of the barn with mud to his boot tops and his hat pushed back. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at the river, visible past the fence line, still running fast and brown with the melt. He was quiet for a moment in the way that she had learned preceded something being said rather than something being left unsaid. He said, "I told you last April I needed someone for the house and for the children. Nothing more than that." She set the bucket down on the ground. He said, "I was wrong about the nothing more." The river moved past the fence line carrying the end of winter. Branches, ice fragments, a season's worth of things that had been frozen in place longer than they were meant to be. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him. He looked back. He was not a man who looked away first, and neither, it turned out, was she, and that had been true since Millhaven. She said, "I know." She said, "I stayed anyway." Something in his face, not quite a change of expression, more a loosening of something held very still for a very long time, shifted and settled. He reached down and picked up her bucket before she could reach it herself. He carried it to the bean rows without asking which ones she wanted, because by now he knew. Iris appeared at the kitchen window a moment later, then moved away from it. She had been watching and had decided she'd seen enough. That evening, 5 plates went on the table the same as every other evening, and Pip fell asleep in his chair before supper was over, and Iris read at her end of the table without looking up, and the stove ticked in its familiar way. She washed the dishes. He dried them. This had not been the arrangement at the start. Neither of them had decided to change it. It had changed the way most things in that house had changed, without ceremony, already halfway done before either of them noticed it happening. Outside, the ice was gone from the river. The sound of it had been so constant all winter that its absence was its own kind of sound. A particular quiet, full of what was no longer held in place, moving at last the way things move when the season that stopped them has finally passed.